The fluorescent lights of the underground car park cast long shadows across the polished concrete floor as Alexander Blackwood strode towards his gleaming Bentley. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the surface with measured precision, echoing through the cavernous space. At 42, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had built his technology empire from the ground up. Beside him walked Victoria, his wife of 2 years, her stiletto heels matching his rhythm. She was striking in her tailored suit, golden hair cascading over her shoulders, the very picture of success and sophistication. Yet from the shadows of a concrete pillar, a pair of keen eyes watched their approach. Sarah huddled in her usual spot, wrapped in layers of worn clothing, her small frame barely visible in the dim light. At 13, she had already learned to be invisible when needed, to observe without being observed. But tonight was different. Tonight, she couldn't remain silent. As the couple approached their vehicle, Sarah noticed Victoria's hand move with practiced subtlety. The movement was quick, almost imperceptible, but Sarah's survival on the streets had taught her to notice details others missed. Victoria's manicured fingers slipped something small and metallic beneath the car's navigation panel. Sarah's heart began to race. She had seen Victoria before, just 3 nights ago, in this same car park. That night, Victoria hadn't been alone. Sarah remembered the stranger's whispered words, the furtive glances, the way Victoria had checked her surroundings before accepting a small package from the unknown man. Alexander reached for his car door, completely unaware of what had just transpired. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She knew the streets were cruel, but there was something about Alexander that stirred a memory she couldn't quite grasp. Perhaps it was the kindness in his eyes when he occasionally dropped coins in her cup. Or maybe it was something from long ago, a fragment of a memory just beyond her reach. "Stop!" The word burst from Sarah's lips before she could stop herself. Her voice echoed through the car park, causing both Alexander and Victoria to freeze. "She put something in your car, sir, under the dashboard." Victoria's perfectly composed facade cracked for just a moment before she recovered, letting out a practiced laugh. "Darling, don't listen to her. She's just trying to get attention. These street children will say anything for money." But Alexander didn't laugh. Instead, he studied Sarah's face intently, then turned to his wife. Something in Victoria's expression made him pause. Perhaps it was the slight tremor in her hand as she reached for her handbag, or the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Victoria," he said quietly, "would you mind if I check just to put everyone's mind at ease?" Victoria's response was immediate and sharp. "This is ridiculous, Alexander. We're going to be late for the board meeting. Since when do you listen? 2 vagrant children over your own wife." But Alexander was already moving towards the dashboard, his movements deliberate and careful. Victoria's protests grew more insistent, her voice rising with each step he took. Sarah watched as Alexander's fingers found the device, small, black, and definitely not part of the car's original design. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander held the device in his palm, studying it with the same attention to detail that had made him a technology pioneer. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension. "Victoria, would you care to explain this?" Victoria's composure slipped further. Her hand clutched her handbag tighter, her knuckles white against the leather. I can explain everything, Alexander, but not here, not in front of..." She glanced at Sarah with barely concealed contempt. But Sarah didn't flinch. She had seen that look countless times before, from shopkeepers, security guards, passers-by. What caught her attention instead was the way Victoria's other hand had slipped into her pocket, fingers working furiously on what Sarah assumed was a mobile phone. Alexander seemed to notice too. "Your phone, Victoria. Show it to me." The request hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's hand trembled as she withdrew her phone, but before Alexander could take it, she turned and ran towards a nearby vehicle. Her heels clattered against the concrete as she fumbled with the car keys, but Alexander was faster. He reached the car door before she could close it, his hand gripping the frame. "Enough, Victoria. Whatever this is, whatever you're involved, and it ends now." As if on cue, the sound of approaching sirens filled the underground space. Victoria's expression shifted from panic to something else entirely. Calculation. Sarah recognized that look. She had seen it on the faces of con artists and pickpockets who worked the streets. Victoria was about to play her final card. As police, lights painted the concrete walls in alternating blue and red. Victoria's demeanor transformed completely. Tears welled up in her eyes, her shoulders hunched forward, and her voice became tremulous. Gone was the sophisticated businesswoman, replaced by someone who appeared vulnerable and afraid. "Officers," she called out as soon as the police approached, her voice breaking. "Please help me. My husband. He's been forcing me to do terrible things. I've been too scared to speak up until now." Alexander stood frozen, watching as his wife of 2 years masterfully turned the situation on its head. The police officers exchanged glances, their hands moving instinctively towards their belts. Sarah could see the confusion in their eyes as they assessed the scene. A well-dressed businessman blocking a crying woman's car door, a strange device in his hand, and a street child watching from the shadows. "Sir, please step away from the vehicle," one officer commanded, his tone professional but stern. Alexander complied immediately, his movements slow and deliberate. "Officers, I can explain everything. My wife just planted this device in my car. The young lady over there witnessed it." Victoria's tears flowed freely now. "He's lying. He's been manipulating me for months, forcing me to help him with his schemes. I was finally going to escape tonight, but he caught me. That device? He made me plant it in other people's cars too. I have proof on my phone." She held up her mobile, her hands shaking. Sarah watched as Victoria's fingers moved across the screen, with practiced precision. Whatever she was about to show the police, Sarah knew it wouldn't be the truth. She had seen too much from her hidden corner of the car park over the past few weeks. "Officers," Sarah spoke up, stepping forward despite her racing heart. "I saw everything. Not just tonight, but 3 nights ago too. Mrs. Blackwood met a man here. They exchanged something and she looked nervous, like she didn't want to be seen." The police officers turned their attention to Sarah, and she forced herself to stand, straight despite her worn clothes and dirty face. She had learned long ago that people judged her based on her appearance, but she wouldn't let that stop her now. "I can describe the man," she continued. "Tall, with a scar above his right eyebrow. He wore an expensive watch, gold, with a blue face. They spoke in whispers, but I heard some of it. Something about server access and deadline." Victoria's composure slipped for a fraction of a second. Her eyes widened, and her hand tightened around her phone. The female officer noticed this subtle change and stepped closer to Victoria. "Ma'am, may I see your phone, please?" Victoria hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen. I just need to..." But before she could finish, the phone chimed. Loudly, a message notification. Victoria's face paled as the officer gently but firmly took the device from her hands. As the officer scrolled through the messages, her expression hardened. "Mrs. Blackwood, these messages, they don't support your version of events. In fact, they suggest something entirely different." Alexander moved closer, his face a mixture of hurt and anger as he glimpsed the screen. Messages about server access, corporate documents, and large sum transfers filled the display. But it was the most recent message that caught everyone's attention. "V, what's taking so long? The buyers are getting impatient. Get the tracking device installed now." The female officer turned to her colleague. "Call it in. We'll need cybercrime unit involvement." As Victoria was led away by the officers, her mask of vulnerability disappeared entirely. She turned to Alexander, her eyes cold and calculating. "You have no idea what you're involved in, Alexander. This goes so much deeper than you know." Sarah watched as Alexander's shoulders sagged slightly. In that moment, he looked older, weary from the weight of betrayal. But when he turned to her, there was gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, simply, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know why you chose to help me, but you've prevented something terrible from happening." Sarah shuffled uncomfortably, unused to direct attention or gratitude. But as she looked at Alexander, that nagging feeling of recognition returned stronger than ever. There was something about him, something from years ago that danced just at the edges of her memory. As the police finished taking their statements, Alexander turned to Sarah again. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight?" Sarah shook her head, suddenly very aware of her shabby appearance in the pristine car park. Alexander seemed to be considering something, his brow furrowed in thought. "Would you be willing to come to my office tomorrow? I'd like to properly thank you, and there's something familiar about you. I can't quite place it, but I feel like we've met before." Sarah hesitated. Years on the street had taught her to be wary of offers that seemed too good to be true, but something in Alexander's eyes, the same kindness she had noticed before, made her nod slowly. Little did either of them know that this moment would mark the beginning of something much larger than a simple act of kindness. As the police, cars pulled away and the car park returned to its usual quiet, the pieces of a much bigger puzzle were already beginning to shift into place. The following morning, Alexander sat in his corner office at Blackwood Technologies, staring at his computer screen with growing concern. The cybersecurity team had worked through the night, and their findings were troubling. The device Victoria had attempted to plant wasn't just a simple tracker. It was a sophisticated piece of technology designed to infiltrate the car's navigation system and, through it, potentially access the company's secure networks. He rubbed his temples, trying to process the implications. The building's security footage from the past month displayed on his screen, showing Victoria's clandestine meetings in the car park. One figure appeared repeatedly, a tall man in an expensive suit, always careful to keep his face turned away from the cameras. But Sarah had seen him, had noticed details that the cameras hadn't captured. A gentle knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. His executive assistant, Margaret, poked her head in. "Sir, the young lady from last night is here, and Mr. Richardson from the board is rather insistent about speaking with you." Alexander straightened in his chair. "Send Sarah in first, please. Tell James I'll meet with him shortly." Sarah entered tentatively, looking even smaller in the massive office with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking London. She'd clearly attempted to clean up, but her clothes remained worn and ill-fitting. Yet there was a sharp intelligence in her eyes as they darted around the room, taking in every detail. "Please, sit down." Alexander gestured to one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Would you like something to drink? Tea, perhaps? Or hot chocolate?" "Hot chocolate would be nice," Sarah replied quietly, perching on the edge of the chair as if ready to flee at any moment. While Margaret arranged for the drink, Alexander studied Sarah more carefully. That nagging sense of familiarity grew stronger. "How long have you been living on the streets, Sarah?" 3 years, give or take," she answered, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. "Since my grandmother fell ill." Alexander leaned forward. "And before that?" "Where did you live?" "Whitechapel. My grandmother worked as a cleaner in an office building." Sarah accepted the hot chocolate from Margaret with a polite, "Thank you." "I used to help her sometimes after school." Alexander's eyes widened suddenly. A memory surfaced. A small girl with bright eyes, helping an elderly cleaner in the building where he'd started his first company. The girl who had found his dropped USB drive containing crucial presentation files, running after him to return it, just before his make-or-break meeting with investors. "The USB drive," he whispered. "That was you, wasn't it? 10 years ago, in Seoul." The Riverside building. Sarah's cup paused halfway to her lips. You remember that?" "That presentation helped secure the funding that launched Blackwood Technologies," Alexander said softly. "I looked for you afterwards to thank you properly, but you and your grandmother had already left." Their conversation was interrupted by another knock. James Richardson, Alexander's Director of Operations and board member, entered without waiting for a response. He was a distinguished man in his 50s, with silver hair and an imposing presence. "Alex, we need to talk about damage control. The press is already sniffing around about Victoria's arrest, and our shareholders are nervous." He paused, looking at Sarah with poorly concealed disdain. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." Sarah began to stand, but Alexander held up his hand. "She stays. Sarah, would you mind telling James what you saw 3 nights ago in the car park? About the man meeting with Victoria?" As Sarah described the mysterious figure and the conversation she'd overheard, James's face remained impassive, but Alexander noticed his left hand twitching slightly, a tell he'd observed during countless poker games at charity events. "A rather convenient witness," James commented smoothly, "though I wonder how reliable the observations of a—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Young street dweller might be. Reliable enough that the police are taking her statement very seriously," Alexander replied, his tone sharp. "Especially given what our tech team discovered this morning. Someone has been accessing our servers using Victoria's credentials, but at times when she wasn't even in the building. The access points trace back to an executive-level account." James's expression flickered for just a moment. "Surely you don't think—" "I don't think anything yet," Alexander interrupted, "but I find it interesting that you were so quick to arrive at my office this morning, James. The news of Victoria's arrest hasn't even hit the papers yet." The tension in the room grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah sat perfectly still, her eyes moving between the two men. She noticed James's hand move towards his pocket, where a mobile phone shape was visible. Alexander noticed too. "Your phone, James. The same model as the one the mystery man was using in the security footage, the one with the distinctive gold case." James's practiced smile never wavered, but his eyes turned cold. "You always were too clever for your own." "Good, Alex, but you're seeing conspiracies where there are only coincidences. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a board meeting to prepare for." As James left the office, Alexander turned to his computer and began typing rapidly. Sarah watched as multiple windows opened on his screen, showing various security feeds and server logs. "He's involved, isn't he?" she asked quietly. Alexander nodded grimly. "Yes, but he's not working alone. James is too cautious to be the mastermind. There's someone else pulling the strings, someone who knows my company inside and out, and I think I know who it might be." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Alexander's office as he paced behind his desk, pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. Sarah sat cross-legged in the leather chair, her initial nervousness replaced by focused attention as she watched him work through his thoughts. 10 years ago, Alexander began, more to himself than to Sarah, I had a business partner, Michael Thorne. Brilliant mind, incredible instincts for technology. We started Blackwood Technologies together in a tiny office in Shoreditch. He paused, pulling up an old photograph on his computer. It showed two younger men grinning at the camera, standing in front of a shabby office building. Michael was my best friend. We'd known each other since university, but we had different visions for the company. He wanted to focus on government, contracts, specifically defense technology. I saw a future in civilian applications, making technology that would help ordinary people. Sarah leaned forward, studying the photograph. "What happened?" "We had a falling out," Alexander replied, his voice heavy with old regret. "Michael accused me of betraying our original vision. He tried to force a company vote, but the board sided with me. He left, started his own company, Thorne Industries. They specialize in military technology now." A notification popped up on Alexander's screen, a new email from an anonymous account. He clicked it open cautiously, his face hardening as he read. "The pieces are in place, old friend," he read aloud. "Did you really think Victoria chose you by chance? Everything that's happened has been leading to this moment. The board meets at 3 p.m. By the end of it, you'll be finished. Unless—" "Unless what?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "Unless I step down voluntarily and hand control of the company to the board," Alexander finished. "Which, given what we now know about James's involvement, means handing it to Michael." Sarah stood up and moved to the window, looking down at the busy London street below. "Mr. Blackwood, when I was living with my grandmother, she always said that people show their true nature in small moments, not big ones. That man in the photo with you, his smile doesn't reach his eyes." Alexander joined her at the window, surprised by her observation. "No, it doesn't. And please, call me Alexander." He checked his watch. "The board meeting is in 45 minutes. Michael thinks he has everything planned perfectly, but he's made one crucial mistake." "What's that?" "He doesn't know about you," Alexander smiled. "And he certainly doesn't know about what you saw in the car park. But more importantly, he doesn't know about your grandmother's old job. Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. The cleaning staff, Master Key. My grandmother, she always said that no one notices the cleaning staff, but they notice everything. Exactly. And if I remember correctly, the cleaning cupboard on the executive floor has remained unchanged for 10 years. It still has the same ventilation duct that connects to the boardroom. Alexander's eyes gleamed with purpose. Sarah, I'm about to ask you to do something unusual, but I promise you'll be safe. Would you help me save my company? Sarah straightened, her shoulders a hint of her old confidence returning. What do you need me to do? The next 30 minutes were a flurry of activity. While Alexander gathered his materials for the board meeting, Sarah retrieved a small recording device from the IT department. With the help of Margaret, who remembered Sarah's grandmother fondly, she accessed the old cleaning cupboard. The ventilation duct was tight, but Sarah's small frame allowed her to navigate it easily. Through the grate, she had a perfect view of the boardroom as members began to arrive. James Richardson entered first, engaged in quiet conversation with another man, tall, distinguished, with grey temples and that same cold smile from the photograph. Sarah activated the recording device just as Michael Thorne began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, he announced smoothly, I've called this emergency meeting because Blackwood Technologies faces a crisis of leadership. By now you've all heard about Victoria Blackwood's arrest. What you don't know is that this is merely the tip of the iceberg. From her hidden vantage point, Sarah watched as Michael laid out his carefully constructed web of lies. But she also saw something else, a subtle exchange between Michael and James, a small nod that confirmed their collaboration. Every word, every accusation was being recorded. At precisely 3 p.m., Alexander walked into the boardroom, his face a mask of calm. Michael's presentation faltered for just a moment before he recovered. Alexander, we were just discussing the recent, unfortunate events. Alexander placed his briefcase on the table, his movements deliberate. Yes, Michael. Why don't you tell them about Victoria? About how you orchestrated everything? About the device she was supposed to plant? In my car. Michael's laugh was dismissive. I'm sure recent events have been stressful, Alexander, but these accusations are absurd. Are they? Alexander opened his briefcase and began laying out documents. Because I have proof of every meeting you had with Victoria over the past 6 months, every payment you made to her account through offshore companies, every communication between you and James about accessing our servers. The confidence in Michael's expression wavered slightly. In the ventilation duct, Sarah smiled as she continued recording. The trap was about to spring shut. The tension in the boardroom could have been cut with a knife as Alexander continued laying out document after document on the polished mahogany table. The other board members leaned forward, their expressions ranging from shock to disbelief as they examined the evidence. These server logs, Alexander explained, his voice steady, show unauthorized access from an executive account. The timestamps correspond exactly with James's private meetings with Michael at the Savoy Hotel. He turned to face his old friend. You always did prefer the American bar there, didn't you, Michael? Michael's composed facade began to crack. His fingers drummed against the table, a nervous habit from their university days that he'd never quite overcome. This is circumstantial at best, Alexander. A desperate attempt to deflect from your own failings as CEO. Circumstantial. Alexander pressed a button on his laptop, and Victoria's voice filled the room. Everything is proceeding as planned, Michael. Once the device is installed, you'll have complete access to his network. James has already prepared the board for the transition of power. The recording continued, revealing detailed discussions of the conspiracy. In the ventilation duct, Sarah carefully adjusted her position to maintain a clear view of the proceedings. She watched as James Richardson's face grew increasingly pale, while Michael's expression hardened into something dangerous. Well played, Alexander, Michael finally said, his voice low and controlled. But you're forgetting something crucial. The shareholders have already been informed of certain irregularities in your management. The press has received very specific information about financial discrepancies. By tomorrow morning, your reputation will be in tatters. Alexander smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You mean these press releases?" He held up his tablet, showing drafted articles that had yet to be published. "It's amazing what one can discover when they know where to look. Your payment to he." The journalist was traced, Michael. Every penny. One of the board members, an elderly woman named Margaret Whitmore, who had been with the company since its inception, stood up. "I've heard enough. Mr. Richardson, Mr. Thorne, I believe you both have some explaining to do," but Michael wasn't finished. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out another set of documents. "Before anyone makes any hasty decisions, you should see these. Alexander's own brother-in-law works for our biggest competitor. He's been feeding them information for months." A murmur of concern rippled through the board members, but Alexander remained unruffled. "Interesting theory, Michael, except I don't have a brother-in-law. You're getting sloppy." In the duct, Sarah had to suppress a laugh at Michael's obvious mistake, but her amusement was short-lived as she noticed James Richardson slowly reaching into his jacket pocket. From her elevated position, she could see what the others couldn't: the glint of a small recording device, different from the one she was using. Sarah quickly pressed the emergency button Alexander had given her, sending a silent alert to his phone. Without missing a beat, Alexander turned to James. "Looking for this, James?" He held up an identical device. "The original recording you planned to play, the one where you edited together snippets of my conversations to make it sound like I was planning to sell company secrets." James's hand froze halfway to his pocket. The boardroom fell silent as Alexander continued. "Our IT team found the audio editing software on your computer. Very sophisticated work. But there was one small problem. You forgot to clear your desktop trash bin." Michael stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is absurd. I won't sit here and listen to these fabricated accusations. The board can make their decision without me." "Sit down, Michael," Margaret Whitmore commanded, her gentle appearance belying a steel core. "We're not finished here." As Michael reluctantly returned to his seat, Alexander opened one final folder on his laptop. "Now let's talk about Thorne Industries' recent military contracts, specifically the ones that were secured using stolen Blackwood Technologies research." Sarah watched as the color drained from Michael's face. In that moment, she understood something profound about power. It wasn't always about physical strength or wealth. Sometimes it was about having the courage to speak the truth when no one else would. The boardroom doors opened, and two police officers entered, accompanied by a woman in a sharp suit who identified herself as being from the Financial Conduct Authority. As they approached Michael and James, Alexander's voice cut through the chaos. "You know, Michael, you once accused me of betraying our original vision, but I never changed. I still believe in using technology to help people, not to manipulate and control them. You're the one who lost sight of what we started." As the officers began their formal procedures, Sarah carefully began her retreat through the ventilation system. Her part in this drama was almost complete, but somehow she knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something new. The evening sun painted London's skyline in shades of amber as Alexander stood at his office window, watching police cars pull away from the building. The events of the afternoon felt almost surreal. The confrontation, the revelations, the arrests. Yet here he was, still standing, his company intact. Sarah sat in what had become her usual chair, a fresh cup of hot chocolate warming her hands. The oversized chair seemed to fit her better now, as if her role in the day's events had somehow made her grow into it. "I still can't believe it worked," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Though I suppose you knew it would, didn't you?" Alexander turned from the window, a tired smile on his face. "I hoped it would, but I couldn't have done it without you, Sarah. Your observations, your courage to speak up that night in the car. Puck, you saved everything I've built." "What happens now?" she asked, her eyes darting to the television mounted on the wall, where financial news reporters were already speculating about the arrests at Blackwood Technologies. "Now," Alexander said, settling into the chair beside her, "we rebuild. The board has called an emergency session for tomorrow morning. There will be questions to answer, protocols to strengthen, trust to rebuild." He paused, studying her face carefully. "But first, I'd like to discuss your future." Sarah tensed slightly, her fingers tightening around the mug. My future? Yes, you have an extraordinary gift, Sarah. Your ability to observe, to connect details others miss, it's remarkable. And your grandmother was right about one thing. Sometimes the most important things happen in the smallest moments. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder. I've had my legal team working on this since this morning. With your permission, I'd like to become your legal guardian. You'd have a home, proper education, everything you need. Sarah's eyes widened, but Alexander wasn't finished. And when you're ready, there would be a place for you here. Not because you helped save the company, but because of who you are and what you're capable of becoming. The mug trembled slightly in Sarah's hands. Why? You barely know me. Sometimes we recognize kindred spirits, Alexander replied gently. 10 years ago, you returned a USB drive to a stranger because it was the right thing to do. Yesterday, you spoke up in that car park for the same reason. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Before Sarah could respond, Alexander's computer chimed with an urgent email notification. His expression changed as he read it, becoming more focused, more concerned. What is it? Sarah asked, recognizing the shift in his demeanor. An anonymous tip, he said slowly, about a series of suspicious transactions that started 6 months before Michael's attempt to take over the company. They're linked to an account in Geneva, but the pattern, it's familiar. Sarah moved to look at the screen, her quick mind already processing the information. These dates, they align with the major technological breakthroughs your company announced last year. Alexander nodded, impressed by her observation. Exactly. Michael and James weren't working alone. Someone else was orchestrating events long before they made their move. Someone who knew our security protocols, our development, timeline, everything. But who would have that kind of access? Sarah asked, then answered her own question. Someone from the beginning. Someone who was there when the company was founded. Yes, Alexander's voice was grim. And I think I know who. The question, Fizz, how do we prove it? Sarah straightened in her chair, a determined glint in her eye. Well, you did just offer me a job, didn't you? Perhaps we should start by looking at those old cleaning staff records. My grandmother always said that the best stories are hidden in the details everyone else overlooks. Alexander couldn't help but smile. In the midst of this new challenge, he felt a surge of hope. The company he'd built might have weathered its most visible storm, but the real work was just beginning. And somehow, having this remarkable young girl by his side made the prospect less daunting. As the sun set over London, casting long shadows, across the office, Alexander and Sarah began to pore over the financial records. They had won today's battle, but both sensed that the war was far from over. Yet there was something fitting about facing these new challenges together. The successful businessman and the street-smart girl, both survivors in their own ways, both driven by a fundamental desire to uncover the truth. The night ahead would be long, but for the first time in years, neither of them felt alone in their respective struggles. Sometimes, Alexander reflected, the strongest foundations are built in the aftermath of our greatest challenges. The following week brought dramatic changes to both Sarah's life and Blackwood Technologies. While the press buzzed with stories about Michael Thorne's arrest and James Richardson's confession, Sarah found herself adapting to a new reality. Alexander had arranged for her to stay in a comfortable flat near his own home in Kensington, with a kind-hearted housekeeper named Mrs. Bennet to look after her. But Sarah wasn't interested in sleeping late or watching television. Every morning she arrived at Blackwood Technologies with Alexander, her mind focused on the mystery of the Geneva account. They had converted a small conference room into their investigation headquarters, its walls covered with printouts, timelines, and financial records. "Look at this," Sarah said one morning, pointing to a series of transactions. Every major withdrawal from the Geneva account was followed by a technological breakthrough announcement from one of your competitors. Not just Thorne Industries, but others too. Alexander leaned over her shoulder, studying the pattern. Someone's been selling our research, but how are they getting access to it? After Michael's attempt to take over, we completely overhauled our security systems. Maybe they don't need current access, Sarah suggested, turning to a stack of old employee records. My grandmother used to say that some stains never wash out, no matter how hard you scrub. What if this person planted something years ago? Something so deeply embedded in the company's systems that no one thinks to look for it. Alexander's eyes widened with understanding. A back door, created when the company was still young, when our security wasn't as sophisticated. He began typing rapidly on his laptop, accessing archived code from the company's earliest days. Sarah watched him work, her mind racing. Who was involved in setting up the original systems? Besides you and Michael. There were 5 of us, Alexander replied, still typing. Michael and I handled most of the coding. James was there from the beginning, but he was more focused on business development. Then there was our first IT manager, David Chen. He retired years ago and moved to New Zealand. And he paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. And, Sarah prompted, Patricia Whitmore, Margaret Whitmore's daughter. Sarah sat up straighter. The same Margaret Whitmore who's on your board now? Yes. Patricia was brilliant with systems architecture. She helped design our first secure network, but she left the company about 8 years ago after a disagreement about the direction of our cybersecurity division. Alexander's voice grew quiet. She wanted to develop more aggressive security measures, ones that could be used offensively. I refused. Sarah moved to the window, watching the bustling London street below. The timeline fits. The suspicious transaction started not long after your company announced its quantum encryption breakthrough last year. That would have been worth a fortune to your competitors. But Patricia, she and her mother were with us from the beginning. Margaret Whitmore is one of our most trusted board members. Sarah turned back to face him. Sometimes the people closest to us can surprise us the most. Just look at Victoria. Before Alexander could respond, his phone buzzed with an urgent message. His face grew serious as he read it. Our system just flagged another unauthorized access attempt. Someone's trying to breach the quantum encryption database right now. They rushed to Alexander's office, where his security team was already tracking the intrusion attempt. Lines of code scrolled across multiple screens as the hackers tried to navigate through the company's defenses. The attack pattern, one of the technicians said. It's unlike anything we've seen before. They're using holes in the system that shouldn't exist anymore, pathways that were supposedly closed years ago. Sarah studied the scrolling data, her quick mind picking up patterns. Look at how they're moving through the system. It's like they know exactly where every back door is hidden, like they helped build them. Alexander nodded grimly. Because they did. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. Margaret, we need to talk about Patricia. As he spoke to the board member, Sarah noticed something odd on one of the security feeds. A figure in the server room moving with purpose despite the late hour. The person's face was hidden, but their movements were familiar. Alexander, she interrupted softly, pointing to the screen. I think I know where our answers are, but we need to move quickly. Alexander ended his call and studied the feed. His expression hardened as he recognized the implications. The server room. They're not just trying to hack in from outside, they're already here. Sarah grabbed her tablet, which contained copies of the old building plans she'd been studying. There's a maintenance corridor that leads directly there. If we hurry, we can catch them in the act. As they rushed from the office, Sarah couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement mixed with apprehension. In just a week, her life had transformed from surviving on the streets to helping unravel corporate conspiracies. But more than that, she felt like she had finally found her purpose, using her unique way of seeing the world to uncover hidden truths. Alexander's phone buzzed again as they hurried down the corridor. Another message from the security team. The intruder had begun, downloading files from the quantum encryption database. The race was on. The maintenance corridor was dimly lit, their footsteps echoing off the metal walls as Alexander and Sarah made their way towards the server room. Sarah led the way, her tablet displaying the building's layout, while Alexander coordinated with security through his phone. The download is at 60%, Alexander whispered, checking the latest update. Whatever they're taking, it's massive. Sarah held up her hand, signaling him to stop. Ahead, light spilled from beneath the server room door, accompanied by the soft hum of powerful computers. Through the small window, they could see a figure moving between the servers. their face illuminated by the blue glow of a laptop screen. "That's not Patricia," Sarah whispered, squinting through the glass. "It's Margaret," Alexander finished, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Margaret Whitmore herself." The elderly board member was typing rapidly on a laptop connected to the main server bank. Gone was her usual gentle demeanor, replaced by focused determination as she worked to extract the company's most valuable secrets. She's been the one all along, Sarah realized. Patricia wasn't selling the information. She was helping her mother access it. That's why the intrusion patterns looked so familiar. They were using the backdoors Patricia built years ago. Alexander took a deep breath, then pushed open the door. "It's over, Margaret." The older woman didn't even flinch. She continued typing, her voice calm and measured. "Alexander, dear, I wondered when you'd figure it out. Though I must admit I didn't expect it to happen quite so soon." She glanced at Sarah. "You can thank your young protégé for that, I suppose." "Why?" Alexander asked, moving closer. "You were there from the beginning. You helped build this company." "Yes, I did," Margaret replied, finally turning to face them. "I watched you and Michael dream big dreams, take foolish risks, while I sat quietly in the background, offering wisdom and support. But when Patricia came to you with her ideas, brilliant, revolutionary ideas, you dismissed them. Just like you dismissed Michael's vision." Sarah edged along the wall, keeping her movements subtle as she worked her way behind the servers. Margaret continued speaking, her attention focused on Alexander. "Patricia understood something you never did, Alexander. True security isn't about protection, it's about power. The power to control information, to decide who succeeds and who fails. When you rejected her proposals, you rejected the future. So you decided to sell our innovations to the highest bidder." Alexander's voice was tight with anger. "Betray everything we built," Margaret laughed softly. "Betray? I've been loyal to the only thing that matters, progress. Every piece of technology I sold pushed our competitors to innovate, forced them to develop new solutions. The industry grew faster because of me." "And the money in Geneva?" Sarah asked, now positioned behind the main server bank. "Was that for progress too?" "Insurance," Margaret replied, giving Sarah an appraising look. "For my retirement and Patricia's future. She's establishing her own cybersecurity firm in Singapore. The knowledge and capital I've provided will ensure its success." "You won't get away with this," Alexander said, taking another step forward. "The authorities are already on their way." "Oh, Alexander," Margaret sighed, reaching for her laptop. "I'm not going anywhere. In about 30 seconds, this download will complete, and then a very special program will activate. One last gift from Patricia. Every server in this building will be wiped clean. Blackwood Technologies will still exist, but without its intellectual property, without its innovations." She smiled. "Well, let's just say the board will be looking for new leadership." But Sarah had been busy while Margaret talked. Using the maintenance access codes she'd memorized from her grandmother's old records, she had quietly logged into the backup system. As Margaret reached for the final key command, Sarah pressed enter on the auxiliary control panel. The servers whirred to life, but not as Margaret had planned. Instead of a system-wide deletion, her laptop screen suddenly filled with scrolling error messages. "What did you do?" Margaret demanded, her composure finally cracking. "Something my grandmother taught me," Sarah replied, stepping out from behind the servers. "Always check the cleaning logs. The night staff reported a malfunction in the backup systems last week, right after you and Patricia had your last meeting here. So we prepared a little surprise of our own." Alexander smiled. "The download you just completed? It wasn't our encryption data. You've just downloaded several gigabytes of carefully crafted evidence. Every illegal transaction, every stolen piece of technology, every communication between you and your buyers. And you've downloaded it using Patricia's own backdoor programs, leaving a perfect digital trail." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor. Margaret's shoulders slumped as she realized her mistake. She had been so focused on Alexander, so confident in her plan, that she had underestimated the street-smart girl who had learned to see what others overlooked. As security officers entered the server room, Sarah felt Alexander's hand on her shoulder. "Well done," he said quietly. Though I have to ask, how did you know about the backup system malfunction? Sarah smiled. Mrs. Bennett, my new housekeeper? She used to be part of the cleaning staff here. We had quite an interesting chat over tea yesterday. In that moment, as Margaret Whitmore was led away by security, Sarah understood something profound about belonging. It wasn't about where you came from or what you owned. It was about finding people who valued you for exactly who you were, even if that person was a young girl who saw the world just a bit differently than everyone else. The autumn sun streamed through the windows of Alexander's office as he reviewed the morning papers. 3 months had passed since Margaret Whitmore's arrest, and Blackwood Technologies was finally emerging from the shadow of scandal. The headlines now focused on the company's resilience and innovation rather than betrayal and corporate espionage. Sarah sat in her usual chair, but everything else about her had changed. Gone were the worn clothes and uncertain posture. She now wore a neat school uniform, her hair neatly braided, a tablet computer in her hands as she worked on what she called her pattern recognition project. The board meeting went well, she asked, looking up from her work. She had developed a keen interest in the company's operations, often offering insights that surprised even the most seasoned executives. Very well, Alexander replied, setting down the newspaper. The new security protocols you helped design have impressed everyone. Patricia's old backdoors have been completely removed, and our competitors are scrambling to catch up with our latest innovations. Sarah nodded, but Alexander noticed a hint of distraction in her expression. What's on your mind? I've been thinking about Margaret, she said quietly, about why she did what she did. It wasn't just about money or power, was it? She wanted to prove something. Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying the young girl who had become not just his ward, but his trusted confidant. What makes you say that? The way she talked about Patricia's ideas being rejected, it wasn't just professional disappointment, it was personal. Like she felt invisible, despite being there from the beginning. Sarah set down her tablet. Like how people used to look right through me when I was on the streets. You're right, Alexander admitted. I never really saw Margaret, not properly. She was always there, always reliable, but I never truly appreciated her contributions. Perhaps, if I had... We can't change the past, Sarah interrupted, showing wisdom beyond her years. But we can learn from it. That's why I've been working on this project. She handed him her tablet. On the screen was a complex diagram showing the company's organizational structure, but with a difference. Instead of traditional hierarchical lines, it showed interconnections between departments, highlighting informal relationships and information flow patterns. Everyone has something to contribute, Sarah explained. Sometimes the most valuable insights come from unexpected places. Like how Mrs. Bennett's knowledge of the cleaning staff routines helped us catch Margaret, or how my grandmother's old access codes came in handy. Alexander studied the diagram with growing appreciation. You're suggesting we restructure our innovation process, make it more inclusive. Not just the innovation process, everything. Create channels for ideas to flow up from every level of the company. After all, she added with a slight smile, look what happened when you decided to listen to a street girl about a suspicious device. Before Alexander could respond, his computer chimed with an urgent notification. His expression grew serious as he read the message. What is it? Sarah asked, recognizing his concern. Someone's attempting to access our quantum encryption database again. But this time the pattern is completely different. It's not like anything we've seen before. Sarah moved to look at his screen, her quick mind already analyzing the data. These access attempts, they're not trying to break in. Through old backdoors, they're probing for new vulnerabilities, testing our defenses systematically. But who would have the capability to... Alexander's voice trailed off as realization dawned. Patricia, she's not in Singapore anymore, is she? Sarah shook her head. The last transaction from the Geneva account wasn't for retirement. It was an investment in a new cybersecurity firm in Seoul. Mrs. Bennett mentioned that Margaret had been practicing her Korean. So Patricia's starting over, building something new. But why test our defenses now? Because she's not trying to steal from us, Sarah said slowly. a theory forming in her mind. Look at the pattern of the probes. She's not targeting our research data. She's testing the security systems I helped design, the ones that blocked her mother's attack. Alexander's eyes widened as he understood. She's not attacking us, she's evaluating us, but why? Sarah smiled, pulling up another file on her tablet. Because of this, 3 days ago, a new cybersecurity contract was announced in South Korea. The government is looking for innovative solutions to protect their infrastructure. They specifically mentioned quantum encryption as a requirement, and Patricia thinks she can win the contract by proving her systems can breach our defenses. No, Sarah replied, her eyes bright with excitement. I think she wants to prove something else entirely, something that could change everything. The next morning found Alexander and Sarah in a secure conference room, surrounded by screens displaying Patricia Whitmore's probe attempts. The company's best security experts had been analyzing the pattern all night, and their conclusions were unexpected. She's not trying to breach our security, the head of cybersecurity explained, pointing to the data streams. She's demonstrating weaknesses in her own systems. It's like she's teaching us. Sarah nodded, her theory confirmed. She's showing us how her new security protocols could complement ours. Each probe reveals a potential vulnerability, but also demonstrates a solution. Alexander paced the room, processing the implications. So after everything that happened with Margaret, Patricia's not seeking revenge. She's seeking collaboration? It makes sense, Sarah said, pulling up the details of the Korean contract on her tablet. The contract requirements are unique. They don't just want quantum encryption. They want a comprehensive security solution that can adapt and evolve. No single company has all the pieces yet. But together, Alexander murmured, beginning to understand. Together, Blackwood Technologies' quantum encryption and Patricia's adaptive security protocols could create something revolutionary. Sarah's eyes sparkled with excitement. That's why she's been testing our system so publicly. She wants us to notice, to understand. Alexander sat down heavily in his chair. After everything that happened with her mother, how can we even consider trusting her? Because she's not hiding anymore, Sarah replied simply. She's not using back doors or working from the shadows. She's showing us exactly who she is and what she can do. Sometimes, she added softly, people deserve a second chance to prove themselves. The words hung in the air, carrying weight beyond the immediate situation. Alexander looked at Sarah, the street girl who had become so much more than just his ward. She had taught him to see beyond surface appearances, to find value in unexpected places. Arrange a meeting, he finally decided, but not here, somewhere neutral. 2 days later, they sat in a private room at the British Library, surrounded by centuries of knowledge preserved in books. Patricia Whitmore arrived exactly on time, her appearance professional but nervous. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said, taking her seat. Her eyes lingered on Sarah with curiosity. "I wasn't sure you would." 3 months ago I wouldn't have, Alexander replied honestly. But I've learned some valuable lessons about looking past first impressions and old grievances. Patricia nodded, then turned to Sarah. "You're the one who figured it out, aren't you? The pattern in my probes." "You weren't exactly subtle," Sarah smiled. "Using prime number sequences in your access attempts. That was clever." Patricia's eyebrows rose in surprise and respect. Most adults wouldn't have noticed that, let alone understood its significance. She turned back to Alexander. "You found quite a remarkable protege." "She found me, actually," Alexander corrected. "Just like you found a way to show us what you're capable of without compromising your principles." Patricia pulled out, her laptop, her movements careful and deliberate. "What my mother did was wrong. She took my ideas about adaptive security and twisted them into something destructive. But the core concept remains valid. Security systems need to evolve to learn from attempts to breach them." She opened a presentation showing a sophisticated diagram of interlinked security protocols. Quantum encryption is virtually unbreakable, but the systems around it, the human elements, the access points, the user interfaces, those are still vulnerable. My protocols are designed to learn from each attempted breach, strengthening not just the specific point of attack, but the entire system. Sarah leaned forward, studying the diagram. Like an immune system, she said. Each attack makes it stronger, more adaptive. Exactly, Patricia smiled. Combined with your quantum encryption, it could revolutionize cybersecurity, not just for the Korean contract, but for everyone. Alexander watched the exchange, seeing the passion for innovation that had always driven Patricia, now tempered with wisdom and humility. He saw too how Sarah's eyes lit up with understanding, her quick mind already seeing possibilities that others might miss. It won't be easy, he said finally. There will be questions, concerns about trust, about your mother's involvement. I know, Patricia replied steadily. I'm prepared to submit to any security clearance, any oversight. What my mother did taught me the importance of transparency, of earning trust rather than demanding it. Sarah spoke up, her voice clear and confident. Sometimes the strongest security comes from unexpected cooperation, from building bridges instead of barriers. Alexander looked at his young protégé with pride, then back at Patricia. Well then, he said, extending his hand, shall we begin building those bridges? As they began discussing the details of a potential collaboration, Sarah sat back in her chair, observing the two brilliant minds at work. She thought about her own journey from the streets to this moment, about how life could change when people chose to see past their prejudices and fears. Outside the library windows, London continued its eternal bustle, unaware that within these walls a new chapter in cybersecurity history was being written, not through conflict or competition, but through understanding and cooperation. Spring had returned to London, bringing with it new beginnings. The cherry blossoms in front of Blackwood Technologies' headquarters were in full bloom, their delicate petals occasionally drifting through the air like pink snow. Sarah watched, them from the window of her new office, a small but significant space that represented how far she had come in the past year. At 14, she was officially the youngest innovation consultant the company had ever had. Though her role was far more unique than her title suggested, her remarkable ability to spot patterns and connections had proved invaluable during the integration of Patricia's security protocols with Blackwood's quantum encryption. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Alexander stood there holding a familiar-looking USB drive. "Remember this?" he asked, placing it on her desk. Sarah picked up the device, turning it over in her hands. "The one I returned to you. 10 years ago, you kept it all this time." "Of course." Alexander smiled, settling into one of her visitor chairs. "It's a reminder of how small moments can change everything. That presentation helped launch Blackwood Technologies, and now here we are, about to launch something even bigger." Sarah nodded, thinking about the upcoming announcement. The Korean contract had been just the beginning. The combination of Blackwood's quantum encryption and Patricia's adaptive security had created something revolutionary, a security system that could learn and evolve while maintaining unbreakable encryption. "The board meeting this afternoon," Sarah said, straightening some papers on her desk. "They're going to ask about Michael and Victoria, aren't they? About whether this partnership with Patricia is too risky." Alexander's expression grew thoughtful. "Probably. Trust is hard to rebuild once it's broken. But that's exactly why your presentation is so important. You see things differently, Sarah. You understand that sometimes the biggest risks can lead to the greatest rewards. Like taking in a street girl and making her part of your company?" Sarah asked with a slight smile. "That wasn't a risk," Alexander replied firmly. "That was the best decision I ever made." Their conversation was interrupted by another visitor, Patricia Whitmore, looking confident yet humble in her role as head of the new Adaptive Security Division. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but the final test results are in. The system didn't just pass the security audit, it exceeded every benchmark. Even the independent testers couldn't breach it." Sarah stood up, excited. "Did they try the prime number sequence variation we discussed?" "They did," Patricia smiled. "The system adapted exactly as you predicted it would. Your pattern recognition algorithms are absolutely brilliant." Alexander watched the exchange with pride. In less than a year, Sarah had gone from living on the streets to collaborating with some of the brightest minds in cybersecurity. Her unique perspective, shaped by years of observing the world from society's shadows, had proved invaluable in understanding how systems and people could be vulnerable. "There's something else we need to discuss," Alexander said, his tone growing more serious. "The educational foundation." Sarah sat up straighter. This was her pet project, something she'd been developing in secret for months. "You've reviewed my proposal?" "The board has," Alexander confirmed. "The foundation to identify and support gifted children from disadvantaged backgrounds, providing them with education and opportunities in technology and security. It's ambitious." "But necessary," Sarah insisted. "Think about how many other kids are out there watching and understanding things that everyone else misses. They just need someone to give them a chance, like you gave me." Patricia nodded approvingly. "It's not just about finding talent, it's about changing perspectives, showing that innovation can come from anywhere." Alexander pulled out another document from his briefcase. "The board has approved it unanimously. The Sarah Bennett Foundation for Innovation and Security will launch next month." Sarah's eyes widened at the name. "You're naming it after me?" "Who better?" Alexander smiled. "You've proved that sometimes the best security experts aren't found in universities or corporations, but in unexpected places. Your story will inspire others." As they discussed the details of the foundation, Sarah glanced out at the cherry blossoms again. She thought about her grandmother, who had taught her to pay attention to the small details that others overlooked. She thought about all the other children like her, watching and waiting for their chance to show what they could do. The afternoon board meeting would mark the official beginning of a new era for Blackwood Technologies. But for Sarah, it marked something even more significant, the moment when her journey from street observer to security innovator came full circle. She had not only found her place in the world, but was now creating opportunities for others to find theirs. The grand auditorium of the London Science Museum hummed with anticipation as Sarah stood backstage, adjusting her presentation notes. 1 year to the day after the confrontation in the car park, she was about to address some of the most influential figures in global technology and security. The Sarah Bennett Foundation was launching officially today, alongside Blackwood Technologies' new adaptive quantum security system. The audience included tech industry leaders, education specialists, and most importantly to Sarah, a group of children from backgrounds similar to her own, selected as the Foundation's first beneficiaries. Alexander appeared beside her, looking proud and slightly emotional. "Ready?" Sarah nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "I've been practicing this speech for weeks. Mrs. Bennett helped me rehearse it over breakfast every morning." "You'll be brilliant," he assured her. "Just speak from your heart, like you did that night in the car park." From the stage came the sound of Patricia's voice, finishing her presentation on the technical aspects of the new security system. "And now," she announced, "I'm honored to introduce someone who embodies everything our new initiative stands for, the remarkable Sarah Bennett." As Sarah walked onto the stage, the lights seemed impossibly bright. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw familiar faces in the audience. Mrs. Bennett, beaming proudly from the front row, the security team who had helped them catch Margaret. Even some of the cleaning staff who had known her grandmother. And there in the middle of the audience sat a group of wide-eyed children ranging from 8 to 15 years old. They were the reason she was here, the reason her hands had finally stopped shaking. "A year ago," she began, her voice clear and confident, "I was invisible, one of countless children living in the shadows of this great city, watching life happen. Around us, we see things others miss, not because we're special, but because we've learned to pay attention to details that others overlook." She clicked to her first slide, showing a series of interconnected patterns. In the world of technology and security, we often focus on complex systems and advanced algorithms, but sometimes the most crucial insights come from simple observation: a suspicious movement in a car park, a pattern in a string of numbers, a connection that others might dismiss as coincidence. The audience leaned forward as Sarah explained how her street-honed observation skills had helped uncover the corporate conspiracy and ultimately led to the development of their revolutionary security system. "But this isn't just about technology," she continued, her gaze finding the children in the audience. "It's about potential. Every day there are brilliant minds watching from the shadows, understanding things that could change the world if only someone would notice them. She explained the Foundation's mission to identify and nurture talent from unexpected places, to bridge the gap between observation and innovation, between potential and opportunity. We're not just looking for future programmers or security experts, she explained. We're looking for observers, people who see the world differently and aren't afraid to speak up about what they see. Because in today's world, security isn't just about writing code or building firewalls. It's about understanding human nature, recognizing patterns, and having the courage to challenge assumptions. As she concluded her speech, Sarah unveiled the Foundation's first initiative, a nationwide program to provide not just education and resources, but mentorship and real-world experience to gifted children from disadvantaged backgrounds. The applause was thunderous, but what moved Sarah most was the expression on the children's faces. She saw in them what Alexander had seen in her, the spark of potential, the hunger for opportunity, the desire to be more than just an observer. After the presentation, as the audience mingled during the reception, Alexander found Sarah surrounded by the Foundation's first students, all eager to share their own stories of watching and understanding from the shadows. "You've started something remarkable," he said quietly when she finally had a moment alone. "Something that will outlast all of us." Sarah smiled, watching as Patricia engaged with a young girl who had already spotted a potential improvement in their security protocols. Nearby, Mrs. Bennett was sharing her own wisdom about observation with an entranced group of children. "We all have our own ways of seeing the world," Sarah replied. "Sometimes we just need someone to show us how to use that vision to make a difference." As the evening drew to a close, Sarah stood by the museum's giant windows, looking out over the London skyline. A year ago, these lights had been nothing more than a backdrop to her survival. Now they represented possibility, potential, and the promise of change. A small movement caught her eye, a reflection in the window showing a young boy carefully observing the room from a quiet corner. Their eyes met in the glass, and Sarah smiled, recognizing in him the same watchful intelligence she had once possessed. She turned to him, extending her hand. "Tell me," she said gently, "what do you see?" And as the boy began to share his observations, Sarah knew that the circle was complete. She had transformed from observer to innovator, from outsider to leader, but most importantly, she had become someone who could help others make the same journey. The future stretched out before them, full of possibilities, waiting to be shaped by those who had learned to see what others overlooked.